Hello, hope all is well. I thought today we'd look at adding some kind of multi-band compressor to the Quad Cortex. Obviously, there's no multi-band compressor block just yet in the Quad Cortex, hopefully soon, as they say. But there are some workarounds that we can do to kind of implement this and add this, which can be especially handy for very heavy sorts of tones. Now, to demonstrate what we're talking about, I put this very simple preset together, and it's an 808 full level into a 5153 red EL34. Just pulled down the resonance and bass a tiny bit. Didn't really mess with the EQ. And then for the cab, we've got an Otto Audio VIIT cab on there, and then a simple high cut and low cut at the end there. Now, the problematic area is kind of like this sort of bass build-up or woofy sound on chugs, and there are different ways of dealing this. So typically within a mix, you might look at, say, EQ and things like that, and quite often there's something called, well, the Andy Sneap trick, which is using like a multi-band compressor to target that area and then reduce that with a compressor that's dynamic, as opposed to an EQ, which is a static reduction of that area of EQ. Now, to demonstrate, to give you an idea of what that area sounds like, I've just used an EQ to isolate that area. And as an example, I'll use a free dynamic EQ plugin that you can download that can do multi-band compression. I'll link to a video I did on this, and it's the TDR Nova. And I'm going to be using it to basically target that frequency and then apply compression on that to give you some idea of why we're doing this. So as you can see, by kind of targeting that area, we're controlling that kind of build-up with chugs, and we're getting kind of like a cleaner and even maybe tighter tone in the process. So how do we go about adding something like that within the Quad Cortex? Obviously, there's no multi-band compressor block, but we can achieve something similar by adding a split. I'll just do a quick note. I made some minor tweaks to the preset compared to the sound before, and that is minor tweaks on the amp EQ, and then I've lowered the high cut on the EQ at the end. So this is where it sounds like now. So there's a bit more bite essentially, but the same issue remains with that kind of bass buildup. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add a split that's going to come in after the cab block actually. So after the cab block, we'll add the split there, and then we'll add the return to come back immediately afterwards. So like one block across. And then under the S or the split mode, we're going to set it to crossover, keep stereo to normal. And then for the frequency, I'd suggest to keep it at, say, 300. But play around with this because you can get different kinds of responses, which will kind of depend on the tuning you're in, and then also the amp settings, the cab, and things like that. So play around with this, anything between maybe 150 up to 350, 400, something like that, and see what kind of sounds good to you or what works best with your preset. The important thing here is to set it in invert mode. So basically with this setup, you're telling it to split the frequencies in two so that anything sent below will be below this frequency, or 316 Hertz in this case, and anything above that frequency will be sent along this top row. And then for the mixer return, we'll just leave as is, so you don't have to mess around with those settings. And now what we're going to do is add a compressor block to control those low frequencies. So add a block here, go to compressor. I'd suggest the solid state comp. Set makeup to 0 here so we can really hear what the compressor is doing. And then I would suggest these settings for attack, release, and also the ratio. So for attack, we're going to go for 10 milliseconds. Release, we're going to go for 0.025 ideally, but that'll measure up to 0.03. And then for the ratio, I'd suggest trying this out at 2 or 4. And then mess around with the threshold to see the kind of tone you're getting. So we'll see how this sounds as is. As the threshold is kind of low, you'll see that there's going to be a lot of gain reduction here. So basically what's happening there is that the compressor is basically reducing the level of those lows or anything under 300-ish hertz. So basically now we're going to mess around with the threshold and get it to the kind of area where it kind of sounds good, feels good to play through, and also gets rid of that kind of woofy, low-mid kind of build-up that we're getting before. So yeah, I think that's sounding pretty good set up like this, at least for my guitar, this amp setup and this cab setup. These things will change, of course, depending on your guitar, your EQ settings and things like that. But this is a cool way of kind of controlling that low-end build-up that you typically get with chugs at least, and various amps that you might be using, especially for high gain tones. Now, a proper multi-band compressor block would be ideal, but this is some way of kind of getting that within the Quad Cortex with the tools that we have at the moment. And hopefully it's something that will come to the unit at some point soon. In any case, this might be a cool way of adding some extra control over the low end without having to resort to kind of crazy EQ moves to further control the bass and basically get a different kind of tone, feel, and response from the presets that you already know. In any case, thanks a lot for watching. Hope to see you in the next video. Take care.